lecture on utilitarianism. Okay? Now, utilitarianism is a moral theory which main motto is this. We want our actions to provide the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Greatest number of people. Okay? Many of you are probably familiar with this idea. And many of our ways we think here in America in moral situations, we think of them just like this. For example, it may be individually really good for me to speed on my way to work because I'm late. But I know that's not for the greater good of everyone else. That's why there's a speed limit. If I go too fast, maybe other people are trying to turn or something like this, and I wreck into them. Okay? Though it may benefit me on my own, for the greater good of everyone else, we have a speed limit, and so therefore I follow the law. Okay? That's what we're talking about. Those are the type of principles. The ones that benefit the most amount of people, those are the ones we should go for, not necessarily the individual. All right? One other big thing we want to make sure here is what we mean by good. It's an important word, right? What the utilitarianists usually mean by good is equal to one's happiness. Okay, so if we want to reread this, the greatest good is actually the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Now, another good question to ask is, well, what do I mean by happy? And most classical utilitarianists mean something like pleasure. Okay, so good equals happiness, and happiness equals pleasure. So to kind of even put this out further, the action which leads to the greatest amount of pleasure for the most amount of people, that is the morally good action. Okay, and any action that would be wrong would be one that does not lead to that. So the greatest displeasure for the greatest number of people would obviously be the worst thing we could do. Okay, now some of you may have a question right away on this word, pleasure, such as, well, aren't there some bad pleasures, like things that we shouldn't increase? What happens if society, it's a whole society of heroin addicts? They think that doing heroin is pretty pleasurable, right? Okay, or at least at first it is, right? We want to do that. There may be some problems there. We're going to look at it in a second, though. Okay. First thing we should do is let's talk about the type of theory utilitarianism is. It is a consequentialist theory. Let's put that up here. Consequentialist. All right. Consequentialist theory. And what that means is an ethical theory that's consequentialist is a theory in which the consequences are what count, nothing else. So therefore, whatever my reasons are for committing the action is one thing, but as long as the results or the consequences that come from my action lead to the greatest amount of good, then it is a good action. This could be contrasted with something like deontology. Okay? In deontology, okay, the intention or duty, which the word deon is for Greek for duty, okay, is what matters. Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative is a version of deontology. Basically, it's that your intentions matter, not so much the consequences. Okay, we are not talking about that type of theory. Utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory. So if we use this term in any of our future lectures or deontology, now you kind of have an idea what they mean. Okay, now. First things first, let's talk about the two kind of founding fathers of utilitarianism, and they are going to be our guide for the rest of the lecture. Okay, so we'll go up over here, we'll go over here. The first one we should mention is Jeremy Bentham, who is definitely known as the father of utilitarianism. Both these guys are, but Bentham is definitely the first one. Okay, Jeremy Bentham, he was born here in, let me get his dates right, 1748. Okay, and I believe died in 1832. Got those dates right here. Yes, we are correct. So Jeremy Bentham is a British philosopher. He is the father of utilitarianism. I also want to mention one of his students, and actually Jeremy Bentham's best friend is James Mill. James Mill's son, J.S. Mill, is the other big utilitarian, and he was taught by Jeremy Bentham and his father, okay, James Mill. All right, here's J.S. Mill, and he was born in, I believe, 1806 and died in 1873. Okay, there we go. Now, both these guys, if we were putting kind of today's terms, would be considered kind of progressive thinkers. Both Bentham and Mill were supporters of women's suffrage. They were supporters of the abolitionist movement. They were both also, especially Bentham, were animal rights activists for their time, kind of a lot different than others. Okay, so overall, these guys were good guys. In my opinion, even though there are a few places I think they could be used for critique on the way they looked at the world, but very similar to kind of Enlightenment time in the 19th century. All right. So let's move on and talk about them particularly. The problem I want to kind of focus on with utilitarianism is the problem of pleasure. Okay, what is pleasure? All right, or let's put it this way: what constitutes good pleasure versus bad pleasure? Because, like I said, for example, I can see how getting knowledge from a book, reading that, could be considered good pleasure. But what about doing heroin? It makes me feel very good. That feels nice to do it, but we consider that bad. How are these philosophers? How do they deal with it? And Jerry Bentham, will use him first. Okay, so let's mark it here, and we'll put up Mr. Bentham. Okay, Jerry Bentham dealt with it with something he called the utility calculus. Okay, calculus. Now, if you want in my lecture notes online for my classes, you can go in and find out a little more about utility calculus, do a bunch of examples. Here we're just going to talk about it in brief and give kind of what happens with it. Basically, utility calculus is designed to deal with the problem, the subjective problem of pleasure, where one pleasure for me could be awesome, like doing drugs, whereas you may consider good pleasures reading a book or going to the opera, something like this. What he decided to do was come up with a group of categories in which we can give a number scale to, in which we calculate what we think would be the greatest utility from doing an action or not doing an action. And these included, here I wrote them down here. I should have memorized myself. I got most of them, but these include things like intensity of a pleasure. The intensity, you have the duration of it, then we have things like certainty, propinquity, that means how soon it's going to occur, the pleasure, propinquity. Okay, you have things like fecundity, which is, if you're in biology, you might know the term, basically means how likely is it to reproduce other pleasures. Okay, you have then purity, how pure is the pleasure? Is it mixed with some bad things? And then finally you have the extent, which I think, and Bentham seems to think, is the most important. Okay, we'll do that with it, all right? Which means how many others will it affect? Okay, now, basically it goes like this, it's very simple. So we have a certain moral situation such as, should I lie to my wife or my husband, okay, or should I not? Okay, maybe I did something crazy last night and I don't want her to know or him to know, and so now I'm contemplating this moral situation. Well, what Bentham suggests us to do is to run it through these categories and see what number we get. Now, it seems kind of weird using numbers, but Bentham says it's pretty easy. So what we do is create a scale, maybe something like 10 to negative 10, okay? Negative 10 being the worst number, okay? Positive 10 being the highest, okay? Or negative 10 being the lowest amount of pleasure or things coming from this, whereas 10 is the highest amount of pleasure. So we'd go through this and ask, okay, if I lied, what is the intensity of the pleasure that I will receive from it, okay? Then the duration of that pleasure, the certainty of that pleasure occurring. Is it something that's going to happen very soon, or is it going to be something that happens way later? Fecundity, will it reproduce other pleasures down the line? The purity of it, how much displeasure will it cause? And finally, how many people will it affect? And then we would run through the same way and go, what if I don't lie? Run through the same things, and we give a number for each of these. At the end, we add up the numbers. Whatever has the highest number, that is what we end up doing. Okay? And this is what Bentham kind of used to hopefully get rid of that subjective problem that could come with, well, this is really going to be pleasurable for me, so I'm going to do it. The only problem we would see, though, and though you can't see it much here if you look at my lecture notes, and you kind of trust me on this, is the problem is how intense is it? And in my opinion, how intense is it? In my opinion, how long will it last? In my opinion, how certain is it? How remote or how near is it? How much will it reproduce? How pure is it? What's the extent? These are all in my opinion, okay? And the problem is you can still be very subjective in each category. I promise I've done these different, this kind of in my classrooms with students, and every time I do it, we'll pick the same problem. Every single class seems to pick a different number for it. The thing is, utility calculus ends up being too subjective still. It doesn't really help the problem. So we need to put that here. It is also too subjective. Not only is it's also really hard to try to put numbers on things and judge them in the kind of whole contrast of everything else that you may be thinking about. All right? So sorry that was really quick, but as we said, these are brief lectures to try to help us out. So that's how Bentham tries to solve the problem of pleasure. It's a good start, but in the end, I don't think it works as well. And his student and his kind of, who came after him, J.S. Mill, okay? J.S. Mill is going to be the one who definitely critiques him for this reason. J.S. Mill actually says that Bentham's calculus kind of shows, or his Bentham's utilitarianism is actually a philosophy that's suited for a pig, not human beings. And this is why, because Bentham still suffers with the subjective side. Basically, he is still stuck on whatever's pleasurable to me, it's what's going to go. Bentham's type of utilitarianism is called hedonistic utilitarianism. Okay? All right? Utilitarianism. Whether he wanted to be that or not, it's another thing, but classically, that is how we've come to know it. And hedonism basically is the idea that all pleasure is good. Okay? Now, is that really true? Many people don't believe so. All right? So, now let's talk about J.S. Mill and how he tried to solve this problem.